So, the thing about my own individual use case is that I I really don't like or approve of the idea of being a guest on a device that I own. I don't support that kind of idea, and unfortunately, by experience, whether or not you agree with me or not, this has been the experience that I've had, and you can, sawed off with your disagreement, honestly. But the the thing about Apple is that when I buy an Apple device, I can expect that it more or less not works, and it works, reasonably well and everything, and the build quality is going to be pretty, solid and everything. It's just that at the end of the day, I will not be able to take, unless it's a Mac, unless it's an actual, like, computer, running, Mac OS rather than, iOS. As long as it's an iOS device, then it's going to be locked down, and I'm not going to be able to do everything that I want to be able to do with it. Now, it's true, perhaps, that I'm able to reflash the firmware on a Mac Mini, or no, I mean on an iPhone, I'm not able to reflash the firmware on an iPhone to change it over to something else that I might support more so. Whereas on, an Android device, as long as I set it up and do the right procedure, I'm able to completely reflash the firmware and use custom firmware on my own phone, which means that I can take, pretty much absolute control over an Android device. Now, I think, and it's my sentiment that, if you own a device, you should be able to be root over that device, which means that you should have complete control over that device. You should basically be able to take absolute control over that device, and that means, effectively, if you want to completely reflash the firmware and switch it over to something else or custom firmware, then you should have that level of dictatorial control over your own hardware, and that is basically expectation. It's a demand. Anything less than is completely unacceptable. You know, anything less than that level of power is not at all or remotely acceptable. And unfortunately, I have found that with Apple, custom firmware not only is not readily available, Apple will interfere and try to do everything it possibly can to prevent you from booting up your device on CFW, which, needless to say, I disapprove of massively. I'm a key dissident in this area. I think that if you have a smartphone, you should be able to use CFW if you so choose, and if the company interferes, that is unacceptable. That is just a baseline expectation that I think that we should have over all devices. No lockdown, proprietary anything. If we want to change the operating system and even the firmware, we should be able to do that. The company should get the fuck out of the way. They should not try to stop you, and that we should be able to expect that and to make that demand at a bare minimum from all companies. That Apple does not meet this bare minimum is unfortunate, at least as far as its iOS devices are concerned. It does not meet this bare minimum as far as the calculus is concerned, and because of that, I have ditched them as a provider. I, rely on Android devices, but I was not willing, ultimately, to take a hit to my dating life when I saw, the when I saw all the videos of women reacting like, he's a 10, but he uses an Android, and they all talked about synchronizing their lives with an Android device. So I went out and I spent a little bit of money, and I bought a from 2024, which is now running, a Blue Bubble server. Now I've loaded it up, I've disabled all the security options and integrity systems so that, it's able to get access to the full private API and everything, and it's able to do all the things and everything that you do on, and get access to the private API, features, which are things like the typing indicators, the mark read and send read receipts, the double tap for quick tap back, the up arrow for quick arrow, the subject lines, the private API, and attachments and everything, and all happen via this the private API, which needs a lot of the security features on iOS disabled. But I did that, so I have access to the private API as well. But I set up a Blue Bubble server, so now effectively I'm on Android and I can use iMessage. So and just use my Blue Bubble server as a relay in order to, and I thought to myself, I'm a tech expert, why the hell, I know how to use command line Unix or Linux or .nix, so why the hell wouldn't I, do something like that? And so I did. And I set it all up, and now I'm able to do iMessage. So, I've got videos that I would link you to go through the whole procedure. It's just that what I would say is that the only area of disagreement I have with them is that I've tried this same trick with a 2014 Mac Mini, and I found it lacking. And what I found lacking about it in particular was that the server would crash basically and require to be rebooted, and then I'd have to start everything back up about every 3 or 4 days. Now I don't mind rebooting a server once a month or so, but when I have to do this every 3 or 4 days, it gets to be a little bit too much maintenance for my taste. So I went out and spent a little bit of extra money and bought myself a 2024 Mac Mini, which meant that the cost ballooned, about 5-fold to do. But I was also seeing a lot of really great reviews of the 2024 Mac Mini, about as much firepower as you could get for that kind of money and everything. And so I went and I got this for myself, and that is my key area of dissent from the rest. But yeah, I went and did that and implemented it, and now I'm running a Blue Bubble server. So now I have switched to Android, and yet I have access to iMessage, making effectively the one vendor lockout trick that they used, or the ecosystem locks that they use, ineffective. I have switched teams, and without making any sacrifices, And why have I done this? Ultimately, it's because let me put it like this: Jobs was a problem, and Tim, who has replaced Jobs, that's the CEO, is no better. Apple and its continued affection for closed ecosystems is just not ultimately acceptable at all. If this firmware is not open, if it's not able to be tinkered with, if it's not able to be prodded around with, if I'm not able to put CFW on it, then it's not acceptable. Ultimately, at a bare minimum, a device that we own, the hardware should actually belong to us, which means we can do whatever the fuck we want with it, and the manufacturer should get the fuck out of the way as far as altering it. That should be a demand that we are able to reasonably make, and that, so I am not willing to accept Apple's, you're going to be stuck in userland mode, the whole time over a device that is supposedly yours. Only oops, everybody has to jailbreak to take full control over their device, or, oops, jailbreaking exists, which disproves this notion that, you really are, system admin over your phone. In Android, in Apple land, everything's nice. It's a nice, fancy hotel and everything, but you can't move the furniture around. Whereas in Android, you can. You can actually move the furniture around as far as the metaphor is concerned, and I felt that being able to move the furniture around is like a baseline expectation that if a company doesn't meet, we should just abandon the product. Don't accept it. Anything less is 100% categorically unacceptable, and it's only unfortunate that my fellow Americans have gone down this rabbit hole of, you know, uh, for the build quality, basically kissing Apple's ass. I am too much of a tech nerd for this, and I am not willing ultimately to accept this, compromise in any of this. And so, yeah, no. I run a Blue Bubble server, fuck Apple, anyways, and I have access to iMessage regardless of whether I use Apple or not. So, I'm, you know, uh, as far as Mac OS, it's a star.nix derivative of some type, so its command line is fairly easy for somebody of my understanding of .nix systems, and yeah, anyways, fuck that. I'm gonna, I'm now I have access to iMessage, and I've incurred pretty much no shipping, no switching cost, and the only area that I really disagree with the guides on is get a 2024. You won't regret it. You won't have to reboot the server every 3 days.